So if I was to show you a video of this camera, you'd go to me, James, mate, that's a Sony FX3. And I'd go, hold your horses, mate. You're not wrong, but you're not right. This is the Sony Fx30. It's basically an FX3 with an APS-C size sensor. However, it still has all of them hard-hitting features that you get out of the Sony FX3, like the 4K 120. You get 10-bit 422. You've got the exact same cinema style body with a top handle with them XLR inputs. You've got the mounting points. You've got this nice grey colour, which doesn't actually do anything to the image, it just looks a bit nice. So before I get into the nitty gritty, the tech, the specs, my pros, cons, faults on this little number, let me show you a couple of clips and you can decide if you think that image is a little bit sick or not. So yeah, let's get stuck in, mate. Bosh. I hope you're all sweet. So the Sony FX30. I personally think this thing is the perfect entry point to someone who wants to get into the cinema line on the Sony system. Coming in at £2,000 and $2,400 for the camera and the top handle, it's basically half the price of the FX3. It's a bit of a no-brainer to have a cinema-style body with that XLR inputs, all of those mounting points. You got 4K, 4K 120, you got 10-bit 422 colour in all of them different frame rates, along with the amazing eye autofocus from the Sony systems. We got human eye tracking, we've got animal eye tracking and bird eye tracking now, which is pretty cool. We've got that 5-axis in-body image stabilisation. We've got the exact same dual card slots, XAVC-S, I, HS. You've got all of these different flavours to choose from. The only difference to the FX3 is that sensor. We've got an APS-C size sensor, which is a 6K downsample to 4K, and we've got a dual native ISO of 800 and 2500. Now, I love the fact that we've got a dual native ISO. Personally, I would have loved to have seen that second dual native ISO a little bit higher, maybe 3200, maybe 4000. If we could have got that second dual native ISO a little bit higher, that would have been lovely. However, this sensor is still really nice and sensitive in low light. As you can see in some of these shots, we literally shot in the pitch black. Obviously, there's some grain there to be expected. It is literally pitch black outside, except for these amazing northern lights, which I'm going to talk about in a minute with this video. I think it's a little bit crazy that we're getting this much cinema style camera in that very, very small amount of money. I also think this camera is going to be a very good B camera for someone who shoots on like the FX3 or the FX6, who want to kind of keep their B camera on a little bit of a budget. A lot of different scenarios don't even really need that larger sensor from the FX3. If you're shooting something where you don't need a load of bokeh, you don't need a really good low light performance, or if you're doing interviews, you want to keep your FX3, your FX6, and then you're going to get your second angle on something like your FX30. So let's talk a little bit about the shoots. Let's talk about my experience shooting with this thing. Obviously, I'm not the most technical geezer. There's plenty of technical people out there that are literally going to get, you know, nitpicks at, and we've got to have them kind of people, but I just ain't that, mate. So I went with my boys Keenan Lamb, who is an incredible cinematographer, shooting with me on this project, and my man Luke Jackson Clark, one of the most insane photographers going, by the way. To the mid on the hands, like just.
I'm going to take a few steps back.
Can you imagine working with this guy? It's a nightmare. Now, straight off the bat, I was really familiar with this camera, obviously shot with the FX3 loads of times, really familiar with the Sony systems. Everything is pretty much as you would expect. We do have that new Sony menu that you get in the FX3, so we get that swipe up of the FN button. We've got the new personalized homepage. We've also got the Cine EI workflow that we've got now on the FX3 and the FX6. So the FX30 kind of integrates kind of perfectly on a workflow perspective to the FX3 and the FX6. So let's take you out to Iceland with me, Keenan and Luke as we went and shot this short piece. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this narrative was all over the place. So originally it was all about taking the opportunity to go and shoot the volcano that was booting off in Iceland. Anyway, got my whole narrative, got my storyboard, got everything ready for that particular event. Apparently this volcano was going to be going off for 6 months and that. We turned up, someone turned the volcano off, mate. Now, as you can imagine, I'm here with these 2 brand new pieces of kit that aren't even released yet. I've got my cinematographer here, I've got Luke shooting the BTS for me, and I'm kind of standing there scratching my head like, well, my narrative's completely out the window. However, this video was all about taking opportunities and not missing opportunities that come up, and obviously having the gear that allows you to take them opportunities by always being ready to capitalise when them opportunities come. And would you believe it, we was blessed with the most incredible opportunity, in my opinion, of a bloody lifetime, right? We got to see the Northern Lights, and we didn't even expect to see the Northern Lights. Like, we didn't know if the weather was going to be good. We didn't hear anything about the forecast that the aurora was going to be booting off the week that we were there. But we got there, driving home, boom, the sky just lit up, mate. And I can't tell you how much I was like jumping up and down like a little kid. And that is where we took the opportunity to shoot the aurora, and that became the new narrative for this piece. So as you can see, the narrative was just all over the place, but it was a really, really fun experience to kind of work run and gun, work really fast, almost single shooter style with this camera out in Iceland where the conditions aren't great. We're not sure if, you know, we're going to get decent weather. The sunsets, we used it in the rain, we used it in heavy wind, we used it in loads of different environments, so we really could kind of put it to the test. The build is exactly the same as the FX3, so it wasn't anything new to us. Keenan's shot on Sonys for years, he knows exactly what he's doing, he's an amazing cinematographer, and for the narrative on this, I wanted to keep it very handheld, run and gun, very fast paced. I wanted to make it feel like the audience were there with us, like you were walking with us, you was in the car with us, you at certain points took a step back, took a breather, observed the scene when we was on a gimbal, and then other times you was right up in there with us when we go handheld. And most of the shots were handheld. Now, the handheld scenario was where we kind of ran into our first little issue with the Sony Fx30. My biggest kind of con with this camera is the rolling shutter. Now, the rolling shutter isn't as good as it is on the FX3. We've obviously got that downsampled 6K sensor on the FX30, whereas we've got that straight up pixel by pixel 4K sensor on the FX3. So what we decided to do with the FX30 to kind of mitigate a lot of the rolling shutter artifacts is the fact that we just rigged it up. We just made it a little bit heavier. Now, obviously the FX30 is perfect for that because it's got all of them mounting points, which is brilliant. So we could mount our top handle on, we mounted on a bottom plate, we mounted on a few little extra accessories to make it a bit more of a handheld rig so that it was a little bit heavier for the style of shooting that we wanted to go for. I obviously wanted to keep it really fast, run and gun, and that is when you're really going to test out that rolling shutter. Any kind of jitters, anything kind of erratic going on in the camera is going to expose them rolling shutter artifacts. If you're on a gimbal or a tripod, you're going to have absolutely no problems, or if you just whack on your image stabilization, you're going to be laughing. But for me, I really wanted to give it that hard, gritty narrative that you get when you go handheld. That feeling of being right there, up in the character's face, right there with them, experiencing what the character is experiencing in the scene. So on this project, we were shooting 4K 25 frames. We also shot quite a lot in 50p, and we done the occasional 100 frames a second. Now, the 100 frames a second actually crops in on the sensor by 1.6. Now, that is quite a big crop, I'm not gonna lie. It's not the end of the world that there's a crop. Most cameras that do, you know, 120, 100 frames a second do crop in on their sensors, but 1.6 is actually quite a big crop. Now, the biggest issue for me with cropping in on a sensor is the fact that the noise on the sensor just gets bigger. We're essentially zooming in on the image and zooming in on that noise. So any noise actually gets larger. So the best thing to do is obviously stick to your dual native ISOs, 800 and 2500. If I was going to be shooting, I would literally just shoot at either 800 or 2500. Obviously, we absolutely cranked it all the way up for when we were shooting the nighttime scenes. We were shooting on that 50mm 1.2, so that was letting in a lot of light, but we're essentially shooting in the pitch black. Now, in terms of the lenses, I was shooting on all full frame lenses, the 16-35 2.8G master, the 50mm 1.2. We did do one shot with a 70-200. That was originally for this volcano that I was meant to shoot, but I just thought, you know what, let's test it out, especially on a gimbal, see how this camera holds up at a crop sensor at about 100mm. And to be honest, the shot actually come out really, really nice. But in general, the only two lenses I really used for this project was 16-35 and that 50mm. Now, obviously, that's not a full frame 16-35 or 50mm, so we are cropped in a little bit on that lens, but I am a massive fan of a Super 35mm look. I don't always think that full frame looks the best for video. It obviously depends on the narrative. It goes for the look that you're going for. But for me, I really like a Super 35mm look. Like the Blackmagic, for example, the 6K is a Super 35mm sensor. So this sensor's got pretty much the exact same size sensor. Now, typically with stills lenses, you get quite a lot of breathing, and we actually have breathing compensation for this camera in Catalyst Browse now, which is really handy. Now, in terms of the dynamic range, we was obviously shooting in S-Log3. Now, S-Log3 on this particular camera gives you 14 stops of dynamic range. Now, I don't know how they've managed to stick that much dynamic range in a sensor that is almost half the size of a full frame sensor. It's a little bit ridiculous. Like at the end of the day, we've got 15.1, I think it is, stops on the FX3, and to go down to an APS-C size sensor and have 14 stops of dynamic range. That is a lot of dynamic range for an APS-C sensor. We can also load up to 16 Luts on the Sony Fx30, which means that you can actually just monitor your image exactly how you'd want to monitor it with the LUT, and you actually get that LUT in the metadata of the clip. So when you're in Catalyst Browse or the Catalyst Browse plugin on Premiere Pro, you can literally see which LUT you've used, and you can actually bake in that LUT in camera on the footage if you want to as well. But personally, I wouldn't bake it into the footage. I just shoot S-Log3 with a monitor LUT on, and then in Catalyst Browse in the edit, you can decide whether to whack that LUT onto the footage or not, so that you've still got the option and the flexibility of S-Log3, but you get to monitor a very, very nice look. So my overall thoughts of shooting with the Sony Fx30. It's an amazing camera. Like, the body is great. I love the ergonomics. I love the fact that we've got them tally lights. For me, I think tally lights are like probably the most underrated thing on the cinema line. You ain't gonna have any problems, especially if you're doing interviews and stuff like that, where it's really important. I've done it in the past, I'm not gonna lie, but it does happen, mate. So them tally lights are really, really good. The mounting points are amazing. You can literally rig it up as and when you want to. You've got them XLR inputs. If you're on a budget, this is the perfect camera to kind of jump into the cinema line on. Obviously, it's not as good as the FX3. We're kind of comparing apples and oranges. We've got a full frame sensor with incredible low light performance, incredible rolling shutter performance. We've got that 4K 120 with a 1.1 times crop, which is nothing. But if the not as good rolling shutter, the not as good low light, and also that 1.6 time crop in 4K 120, I hardly ever use 4K 120 anyway, so it doesn't really bother me. But if them three little kind of niggles aren't of an issue to you, this camera is an unbelievably well-priced camera, coming in at almost half the amount of the Sony FX3, when in some scenarios, you're not really going to be able to tell the difference between the FX3 and the FX30. But I think that this is the most ideal scenario if you want to get into the cinema line. I don't really see that many cons in it. Let me know what you lot think in the comments. Do you like the footage out of this thing? Do you think it's a well-placed camera, or do you think it's just a camera that shouldn't even be in the lineup? Let me know your thoughts. I'm very, very curious. And as always, mate, I'll be catching you lot in the next one, mate. Bye.